The judge's voice cracked like a rifle shot across that courtroom. "Take it off." Just 3 words, uttered with such dismissive authority, and in his mind, 18 years of my life, my entire career, meant absolutely nothing. I stood there in my dress uniform, my navy cross catching the fluorescent light, and I felt every eye in that room land on my chest, like a verdict already decided. My sister-in-law was smiling. She thought she'd already won, but she had no idea what was sitting inside my briefcase. And neither did the man in the black robe who was about to destroy his own career without even realizing it. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I've spent 18 years wearing this uniform. I've bled for it. I've buried friends who wore the same one. And on a gray Tuesday morning in a county courthouse that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, I found myself standing trial, not for anything I'd done wrong, but because a woman I'd once called family decided my honor was something she could put a price tag on. I want to tell you how I got there, because it didn't happen overnight. Nothing like this ever does. I joined the Army at 22, right out of college, back when my father used to joke that I had more stubbornness than sense. He wasn't wrong. I served 2 decades, most of it overseas, chasing missions I still can't talk about at dinner parties. I was wounded once, badly enough that I spent 4 months relearning how to walk without wincing. And somewhere in the middle of all that, during a joint operation with a Marine unit that I still think about at 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes, I earned something called the Navy Cross. It's not a medal soldiers talk about, it's a medal you carry quietly. Because the people who understand what it costs don't need you to explain it. And the people who don't understand never will. I never wore it to family dinners. I never brought it up at church picnics or mentioned it when neighbors asked what I did for a living. I'd simply say, "I'm in the Army," and leave it at that. My mother used to tell people her daughter was a hero, and I'd change the subject so fast you'd think she'd insulted me. That's just who I am. Quiet, steady. I don't need applause to know what I did was real. But my sister-in-law, Melissa, she was cut from a different cloth entirely. Melissa married my brother David about 12 years ago, and from our very first Thanksgiving together, I could feel her, not just looking at our family, but sizing us up, like a woman taking inventory. She had a way of seeing things. The antique china cabinet, my mother's wedding ring, even the deed to the old house. It was as if she was constantly calculating their resale value in her head. David loved her, and God knows I tried to see what he saw. But love doesn't erase the way somebody treats a waitress, or the way they talk about people behind their backs the second they leave the room. When my parents passed, my father first, from a heart that had given out slowly over years, and my mother 18 months later, from a grief I don't think she ever intended to survive, they left the family house to David and me equally. It was a modest place, nothing extravagant, white clapboard, a wraparound porch, and an oak tree in the backyard my father had planted the year I was born. But it wasn't about the money. It was the last piece of them we had left. Melissa didn't see it that way. She saw square footage. She saw a listing price. She started pushing David almost immediately. Sell the house, split the cash, let's use it for the kids' college fund. Let's use it to expand the business. Let's use it for anything except letting it sit there gathering dust and memories. David, to his credit, resisted for a while. But Melissa has a way of wearing people down. She didn't yell, you see. She'd just repeat herself, softer and softer, until you'd agree just to make the noise stop. I refused to sell. I told David I wanted to keep it in the family. Maybe fix it up. Maybe let his kids spend summers there the way we used to. He seemed to understand. Melissa did not. Months went by. Phone calls got shorter. Holidays grew tense. And then, one afternoon in early spring, I got served with legal papers at my own front door, delivered by a man in a windbreaker who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Melissa was suing me. The claim on paper was about misappropriation of shared property. Fancy words for something much simpler. She wanted to force a sale. And when I wouldn't budge, she decided the courtroom was where she'd get her way. I remember standing on my porch that day, papers in hand, feeling something I hadn't felt since my last deployment. Not fear exactly, more like the cold, clarifying calm that comes right before you have to do something difficult. David called me that night, apologetic, torn, caught in the middle of a war he never wanted. I told him I understood. I wasn't angry at him, but I also wasn't going to fold just because someone decided my patience was a weakness to exploit. So there I was, weeks later, walking into that courtroom in my dress uniform. Not for show, not for sympathy, but because I'd just come from a veterans memorial service that morning and hadn't had time to change. My Navy Cross was pinned exactly where regulations said it should be. I sat down at the defendant's table, straightened my jacket, and glanced once at Melissa, who was already whispering something to her lawyer, with a smile stretched a little too wide across her face. I had no idea sitting there how strange this day was about to get. Judge Richard Harland, a heavy-set man with a reputation for running his courtroom like a personal kingdom, banged his gavel to call us to order. He scanned the paperwork, then glanced up at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. Something sharp, almost a look of personal offense. He leaned forward, tapped his pen against the bench, and then uttered the words that would unravel his entire career. "This is not a place to show off war trophies." I'd heard about Judge Harlan before I ever set foot in his courtroom. Everyone in that county had. Lawyers talked about him the way you'd talk about weather you couldn't control. You just braced yourself and hoped you'd get through the day without getting struck by something. He had a reputation for arrogance, dressed up as authority, for cutting people off mid-sentence, for making examples out of anyone who dared to look too comfortable in his courtroom. And apparently, somewhere along the way, he'd developed a particular disdain for what he called military theater. People, in his mind, who used their service like a costume to win sympathy points. I didn't know that yet. I only knew that a man in a black robe had just accused me, in front of a packed courtroom, of showing off. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice level. 18 years of training does that to you. It doesn't matter how fast your heart is pounding, your voice learns to stay flat, controlled, unreadable. This uniform isn't a costume. I came from a memorial service this morning. He didn't even look up from his paperwork. "Take off the medal." The room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone suddenly realizes they're watching something they shouldn't be. I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. I could hear someone's chair creak in the gallery. My attorney, a sharp young man named Foster, who I'd hired mostly because he came recommended by a fellow veteran, started to rise out of his seat, his mouth already forming an objection. I put my hand gently on his arm and shook my head just slightly. "Not yet." "Is that an official order of this court?" I asked. Harlan's eyes flicked up to mine for the first time, and I saw something there I recognized instantly. The particular irritation of a man who isn't used to being questioned. "Yes," he said, drawing the word out like he was doing me a favor by even answering. "It is." Beside me, I heard Melissa exhale a soft, satisfied breath. She leaned toward her lawyer and whispered something I couldn't quite catch, but I didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone, gloating. She thought this was the beginning of my unraveling. She thought a man in a robe telling me to strip a piece of my identity off my chest was going to break something in me. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of every eye in that gallery. Somewhere behind me, I heard a low murmur ripple through the rows of spectators. Court days like this one usually drew a strange mix of people. Retirees who came just to watch, law students doing research, a few regulars who treated the courthouse like a soap opera they couldn't miss an episode of. And scattered among them, I noticed, were a couple of older men sitting stiff-backed in the third row, the kind of posture you only get from years of formation drills. One of them, a silver-haired man in a faded ball cap, was staring at my chest with an expression that had shifted from curiosity to something closer to disbelief. He recognized it. I could see it happen in real time, the moment his eyes landed on the medal and something clicked into place. His jaw tightened. He leaned over and murmured something to the man beside him, who then also turned to look at me, this time with wide eyes. Neither of them said a word out loud. Nobody ever does in a courtroom. You learn early that the silence is its own kind of law, heavier than anything written down in a statute book. But I could feel that old veteran's discomfort radiating off him like heat from a stove. He knew exactly what that medal meant, and he knew exactly how wrong this moment was, and he sat there in his folding chair, unable to do a single thing about it. I thought about my father in that moment. Oddly enough, he used to tell me that the loudest rooms were rarely where the real decisions got made. The real decisions happened in the quiet ones, in the pauses between words, in the choices people made when they thought no one important was watching. I'd carried that with me through every deployment, every debrief, every long silence in a command tent, waiting for orders that might never come. This felt like one of those quiet rooms, and I intended to make my decision count. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. "Before I comply, I'd like the record to reflect the nature of this request." Harlan's jaw tightened the way a man's does when he senses he's being handled, but can't quite articulate how. "Ms. Brooks, this isn't a debate." "Major Brooks," I corrected quietly. Not sharply, just a fact laid on the table like a card. And I understand it isn't a debate. I only want the transcript to be accurate. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Irritation, yes, but underneath it, something else. A flicker of uncertainty, like a man realizing the floor beneath him wasn't quite as solid as he'd assumed. He recovered quickly, straightening his robe, clearing his throat with the practiced authority of someone who'd spent years never being challenged in his own courtroom. "Proceed with whatever you need to proceed with," he said, "but the medal comes off before we continue." I didn't argue further. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached down, unclasped my briefcase, and set it on the table in front of me with a quiet, deliberate click that seemed to echo louder than it should have in that hushed room. Melissa's smile faltered just slightly as she watched me open it. The briefcase was the same one I'd carried through 3 different duty stations. Its leather worn soft at the corners, a small nick near the handle from where it had been dropped getting off a transport plane in weather I'd rather not remember. Inside, tucked in a blue folder I'd prepared weeks earlier, not out of paranoia, but out of the same discipline that had kept me alive in places most people only see on the news, was everything I needed. I didn't say much. I never do in moments like that. Words tend to lose their weight when you throw too many of them around. So, I've learned to let documents speak, when documents can speak better than I can. "Permission to approach, Your Honor?" I said. When he nodded almost impatiently, I walked the folder up to the bench myself instead of routing it through the clerk. I wanted him to have to open it. I wanted him to have to touch it. He flipped it open with the kind of practiced disinterest judges use when they've seen 10,000 exhibits and expect the 10,001st to be just as forgettable. The first page was a formal citation confirming the award of the Navy Cross, complete with the operational details that had been cleared for release, signed off by officers whose names carried weight in rooms far more serious than this one. I watched his eyes move across it. His expression didn't change much, but his hand resting on the edge of the bench went still. The second page was a Department of Defense verification record, the kind of document that exists specifically to settle disputes about military honors. Because apparently, in a country as large as ours, there are enough people willing to lie about their service that the government keeps official channels just to shut those lies down. Mine wasn't a lie. Mine had a case number, a verification stamp, a chain of signatures going back years. The third page was a formal legal opinion from the Office of the General Counsel. It detailed something most civilians never even consider: the established protections and protocols governing the wearing of duly awarded military decorations during official proceedings. This wasn't a suggestion or a courtesy. It was policy, backed by federal guidance. It spelled out, in plain and unambiguous language, exactly what judicial officers were expected to understand before making demands like the one Judge Harland had just issued. I watched the color in his face shift, subtle at first, like a man realizing the ground under his feet had a crack in it he hadn't noticed. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. It came out clipped, defensive, the tone of a man trying to talk himself back onto solid footing. Melissa shifted in her seat. I didn't look at her, but I could feel the shift in her energy from across the room, the way you feel a change in weather pressure before the storm actually breaks. Her lawyer leaned over and murmured something to her, and whatever he said didn't seem to comfort her much, because her hands folded in her lap, tightened into fists. I kept my voice even, calm, the same voice I used to give directions to soldiers half my age with fear behind their eyes. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd ask that you read the final page." He hesitated just for a second, but I saw it. The flicker of a man who suddenly understood he was standing somewhere he hadn't meant to stand, in front of an audience he hadn't accounted for, holding a piece of paper that was about to matter a great deal more than he wanted it to. He turned the page. I already knew what it said. I'd written the accompanying letter myself weeks before, when I first suspected this case might not stay contained to a simple property dispute. Melissa wasn't the type to let things go quietly, and I'd learned a long time ago that the best way to survive an ambush is to know it's coming before the first shot is fired. I watched him read. I watched his jaw work slightly, the muscle beneath his cheek tightening and releasing, tightening and releasing. I watched the flush climb up from his collar. That particular shade of red that isn't embarrassment exactly. It's closer to the color of a man realizing he might have just made a mistake in front of witnesses, in front of a court reporter, in front of a room full of people who would remember exactly what he said and how he said it. Somewhere behind me, the old veteran in the third row shifted forward in his seat, like he sensed something was about to happen and didn't want to miss it. Harlan set the folder down slowly, deliberately, as though handling something that might detonate if jostled too hard. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and for the first time all morning, his voice didn't carry the weight of command. It carried something closer to concern. "I've had legal counsel for some time, Your Honor," I said simply. I anticipated this might become more complicated than a property dispute. He didn't answer right away. He just sat there staring down at that final page, his knuckles whitening slightly against the wood of the bench. I glanced just once at the court reporter, whose fingers had never stopped moving across her keys, every word of this exchange disappearing into the permanent record of that day. The final page was a memorandum, one most people outside legal and military circles rarely encounter. It's tucked away in guidance documents distributed to federal and state courts alike, laying out in plain and unambiguous language the expectation that judicial officials handle properly worn military uniforms and decorations with appropriate respect during court proceedings. Any request to remove them, it stated unequivocally, must be grounded in clear legal necessity, not personal discretion or assumption. There was no ambiguity in it, no room for a judge to claim he simply hadn't known better. I watched Harlan read it twice. His lips moved slightly on the second pass, the way people do when they're not just reading anymore. They're calculating, running numbers in their head, trying to figure out how bad this actually was. How many people in that room had already seen enough to remember it clearly later? My attorney, Foster, cleared his throat beside me. "Your Honor, given the sensitivity of this matter, I'd like to formally request that the court's remarks from this morning be preserved verbatim in the official transcript." Harlan's eyes snapped up. "That's already standard procedure, Counselor. Just wanted it on the record, Your Honor," Foster said, and I caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't gloating. He was too professional for that. But there was something satisfying in watching a man who'd spent the morning throwing his weight around suddenly realize the floor was made of glass. The court clerk, a woman I hadn't paid much attention to until that moment, spoke up from her small desk near the bench. "For the record, Your Honor, today's proceedings are being recorded as per standard courtroom policy." I don't think Harlan had forgotten that fact. I think, in the rush of his own irritation, he simply hadn't thought through what it meant. Every word he'd said, every dismissive comment about war trophies, every clipped demand that I strip a medal off my chest without so much as asking why I was wearing it, had been captured, preserved, time-stamped, and available, if it ever needed to be, to people whose job it was to review exactly this kind of conduct. I watched something shift behind his eyes. It wasn't quite panic. Men like Harlan don't panic easily. They've spent too many years mistaking control for invincibility. But it was the beginning of something close to it. The dawning, uncomfortable awareness that he'd walked into a moment he couldn't simply talk his way back out of. Beside me, Melissa had gone very still. I glanced at her once, just briefly, and saw the calculation happening behind her eyes too. She'd expected this morning to go a certain way. She had expected me to fold, to get flustered, to make some kind of scene that would paint me as unstable or difficult in front of a judge who already seemed inclined to see me that way. She hadn't expected the ground to shift underneath the judge instead. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my tone measured, almost gentle. "I understand the court has a great deal of discretion in how it manages proceedings. I've never questioned that. I only wanted to make sure that any request made of me today was made with full information." He didn't respond right away. He set the folder down, folded his hands together on top of it, and took a long breath. The kind of breath men take when they're trying to buy themselves a few seconds to think. "Let's move forward," he finally said, his voice quieter than it had been all morning. "We'll revisit procedural matters later." It wasn't an apology. I hadn't expected one. Not yet. Men like Harlan don't apologize in front of an audience. The most you can hope for in the moment is a retreat, a small tactical withdrawal, while they figure out how much damage has actually been done. But I'd been in enough command rooms to recognize retreat when I saw it. And this was exactly that. A man quietly repositioning, trying to look like he was still in control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. I sat back down. Foster leaned over and murmured, "That went well." "It's not over," I murmured back. Because it wasn't. Not yet. Melissa's lawsuit was still sitting on the table, unresolved. And beneath the surface of everything that had just happened was the real reason I was there. An inheritance. A house my parents had left us. A sister-in-law who'd decided greed was worth destroying a family over. The medal, the memorandum, the judge's misstep, none of that erased the actual claim being made against me. It had simply exposed something rotten in how the morning had begun. I looked over at Melissa, who was whispering fiercely to her attorney now. her earlier composure cracking at the edges. Whatever confidence she'd walked in with that morning had thinned considerably in the last 20 minutes, and I could see her trying to recalculate, trying to figure out a new angle, a new way to spin this back in her favor. She wasn't going to find one, not with what I still had left to present. I leaned toward Foster and said quietly, "I think it's time to call the witness." He nodded, gathering his papers, and I stood, smoothing the front of my jacket, feeling the weight of the Navy Cross still resting exactly where it belonged. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the courtroom, "I have one more witness to call." The courtroom doors opened with a heavy, deliberate sound, the kind of sound that makes people turn in their seats even before they know what they're turning to look at. I didn't have to turn myself. I already knew who was walking in, because I'd called him 3 weeks earlier, sitting alone in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, explaining as calmly as I could that I needed him, that this was bigger than a house, bigger than Melissa's greed, bigger than anything I'd expected when I first got served those papers. Colonel Michael Sanders had been my commanding officer during the deployment that earned me the Navy Cross. He was retired now, silver-haired, still carrying himself with the kind of posture that made civilians instinctively straighten up when he walked past them. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years, not since a reunion dinner where we'd spent most of the night not talking about the mission at all, because some things you carry together in silence rather than words. He walked down the center aisle in a suit instead of a uniform. But it didn't matter. Everyone in that courtroom could tell just from the way he moved that this was a man who'd spent his life giving orders and having them followed without question. Harlan's expression shifted the moment Sanders took the stand. I don't think he recognized him immediately, but he recognized something, a presence, a gravity that filled the room differently than anything that had come before it. Foster walked him through his credentials first. 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments as a young officer, then years commanding units overseas, including the joint operation where he'd served as my direct commanding officer. He answered each question with the flat, unhurried precision of a man who'd testified in front of far more serious tribunals than a county courthouse handling a property dispute. "Colonel Sanders," Foster asked, "can you confirm Major Brooks's account of the events that led to her receiving the Navy Cross?" "I can," Sanders said. "I was there. I submitted the recommendation myself." He described it plainly, without embellishment, the way men who've actually seen combat tend to describe it. None of the swelling music you hear in movies. Just facts laid out one after another, each one heavier than the last. He talked about the operation, about the moment things went wrong, about a decision I'd made under fire that had saved lives that weren't supposed to make it out of that situation. I sat very still while he spoke. I always do when someone else tells that story. It's easier to hear it in someone else's voice than to carry the weight of telling it myself. I noticed the old veteran in the third row lean forward, elbows on his knees, listening like a man in church. Then, Colonel Sanders said something that hadn't been in our rehearsed questions, something I hadn't planned for at all. "I should also mention," he said, turning slightly towards the bench, his gaze meeting Judge Harlan's, "that I spent the last several years of my career training judicial and legal personnel in military protocol. That includes proper courtroom conduct regarding uniforms and decorations. It's part of a continuing education program many jurisdictions require." The room went very quiet. Sanders looked directly at Harlan, not aggressively, not with any theatrical flourish, just with the plain, unblinking directness of a man who'd spent his life dealing with people who thought their authority excused them from doing their homework. "You should have known this," he said. "It's not obscure information, it's basic training material." Harlan's face went through several colors in the span of about 4 seconds. I watched his hand tighten on his gavel, watched him glance toward the court reporter, watched him realize, too late, obviously too late, that every word being said in that room was already permanent. Melissa's attorney rose abruptly. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess." "Denied," Harlan said, a little too quickly, a little too sharply, the kind of response that comes from a man trying to reclaim control he already knows he's lost. It was, I would later realize, exactly the wrong move. A recess would have given everyone a moment to breathe, to reset, to let the temperature in that room drop back down to something manageable. Instead, he just made it clear he wanted this over with as fast as possible. And in a room full of people who were already watching him carefully, that kind of urgency read as exactly what it was. Melissa was pale now, her earlier bravado nowhere to be found. She kept glancing at her lawyer like she expected him to produce some kind of miracle. But lawyers can't manufacture miracles out of a case that was never built on solid ground to begin with. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. Foster looked at me, a question in his eyes. I gave him a small nod, the kind you give someone right before you commit to something you can't take back. Your Honor, I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying easily across the silence. Before we continue, there's something I need the court to be aware of. I set the phone down on the table in front of me, screen facing up. Please go ahead, I said, mostly to myself, mostly to the moment itself. I hadn't planned to use the phone that morning. Truthfully, I'd hoped I wouldn't need to. But somewhere between the judge's first careless demand and Colonel Sanders's testimony, I'd watched a pattern unfold that told me exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. Someone who mistook his robe for immunity, who assumed that behind those walls, his word was the only law that mattered. And men like that don't stop on their own. They stop when something bigger than their own certainty finally catches up to them. I nodded to Foster, and he connected my phone to the small display screen the court used for evidence presentations. It took a moment for the technician in the corner of the room to get the cable working. A small, almost comically ordinary delay in the middle of a moment that felt anything but ordinary. Nobody spoke while we waited. I could hear the air conditioning again, that same low hum from earlier, and somewhere behind me, a chair creaked as someone shifted their weight. Then, the screen flickered to life. It displayed a confirmation notice, time-stamped and official. A formal complaint had been submitted just minutes before the proceedings began that morning. Now, let me be clear. This wasn't an act of malice, nor was it a trap I'd set for the judge to walk into blindly. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I hadn't known exactly how the morning would unfold, but from the tone of the pretrial filings and a few conversations with Foster, I sensed this case was being engineered to be far more theatrical than it needed to be. And I'd learned a long time ago that when you sense a fight coming, you prepare before it arrives, not after. The complaint wasn't filed to punish anyone in advance. It was filed to protect the integrity of the process, to make sure that whatever happened in that courtroom happened under proper scrutiny, the same way every serious military operation I'd ever been part of required oversight, documentation, accountability. It's not about revenge. It's about making sure the people entrusted with authority actually earn the right to keep it. The recipients were listed clearly on the screen: the Judicial Oversight Committee, the state's Judicial Ethics Investigator, and the Regional Veterans Affairs Liaison Office, given the nature of the potential violation. Each name sat there in plain black text, undeniable, unchangeable, already in motion before the first word had even been spoken that morning. I heard Harlan's breath catch just slightly. It was such a small sound, but in a silent room, small sounds carry. Everything said here today, I explained, keeping my voice level, has already been recorded through the court's own system, as confirmed by the clerk. That recording, along with today's transcript, will be part of the review process. Harlan didn't say anything right away. He sat there staring at the screen, and I watched something settle over his face that I recognized instantly, because I'd seen it before in soldiers who just realized the terrain they were standing on wasn't the terrain they thought it was. It's a particular kind of stillness, not fear, exactly, more like the sudden, sinking understanding that the outcome of the next several months was no longer entirely in your hands. He understood, I think, faster than most people would have, exactly what this meant. An independent review process, once triggered, doesn't simply go away because the person under review apologizes or backpedals. It runs its course. It examines everything, not just this morning's conduct, but potentially other cases, other complaints, other patterns that might have been sitting quietly in a file somewhere, waiting for someone brave enough, or simply prepared enough, to bring them into the light. Melissa had stopped whispering to her lawyer entirely. She sat with her hands pressed flat against the table, her eyes darting between the screen and the judge, as though she was only now beginning to understand that this morning had never really been about her lawsuit at all. Not anymore. Whatever leverage she thought she had walking into that courtroom had evaporated somewhere between the first page of that blue folder and this final, quiet unraveling. I saw her eyes well up, though she fought it, blinking hard, jaw tight, the same stubborn set to her face I imagined she wore whenever things didn't go her way. I felt something for her in that moment, oddly enough. Not sympathy exactly, more like a distant, complicated recognition that greed rarely starts out as greed. It starts out as fear, or resentment, or a belief that you deserve more than what you've been given, and somewhere along the way, it curdles into something uglier. I didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't the moment for it. Harlan set down his gavel very slowly, like a man setting down something fragile. "The court," he said, and his voice, for the first time all morning, carried none of its earlier weight, none of its earlier certainty. "We'll take a recess." He stood. The bailiff moved to escort him from the bench, though no one had asked for assistance. The room stayed silent for a long moment after he disappeared through the side door, as though everyone needed permission to breathe again. I sat back down slowly, feeling the adrenaline finally start to drain out of my shoulders. And for the first time that morning, I let myself glance over at Melissa, who wouldn't meet my eyes at all. 3 months passed before the Judicial Oversight Committee released its findings, and in that time, life did what life always does. It kept moving, whether you were ready for it or not. I went back to work. I attended a funeral for a fellow veteran I'd served with years earlier, stood at attention in a cemetery under a gray sky, and thought more than once about how strange it was that honor sometimes gets tested in places you'd never expect, not just on a battlefield, but in a courtroom on an ordinary Tuesday morning. When the results finally came in, they came through a formal letter, plain and understated, the kind of document that carries enormous weight despite its unremarkable appearance. Judge Richard Harland had been formally disciplined following the investigation, and ultimately removed from the bench. It wasn't framed as punishment for one careless remark about a medal. It was the result of a broader review that examined his conduct patterns over several years, and my case, it turned out, had simply been the thread that unraveled the rest. I felt no sense of victory or satisfaction reading it, only a quiet, settled understanding that something had been corrected, something that desperately needed correcting. Melissa's lawsuit collapsed not long after that. The judge assigned to the reopened proceedings reviewed the original claims and found them baseless, built on nothing but frustration and a desire for a payout that was never legally hers to demand. The court ordered her to reimburse my legal costs, a consequence of what the ruling called a meritless filing pursued in bad faith. I remember reading that phrase, bad faith, and thinking about how rarely the law finds language sharp enough to describe what greed actually looks like up close. The family found out everything. Eventually, David came to see me on a Sunday afternoon a few weeks after the ruling, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never drank. He apologized, not just for the lawsuit, but for years of not paying closer attention, for letting Melissa's resentment simmer without ever really asking where it came from or where it was heading. I told him what I'd learned a long time ago in the Army, that you can't always stop someone from making a mistake, but you can decide how you respond when the dust settles. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had my brother back, not just a man caught in the middle of someone else's storm. Melissa left not long after, not just the marriage, though that came too, eventually, quietly, without the drama I think she once imagined she was capable of creating. She left the family altogether, distancing herself from gatherings, from holidays, from the slow, patient work of repairing what she'd spent years chipping away at. I don't know exactly where Melissa is now. Sometimes, I wonder if she thinks about that morning in the courtroom, about the moment the ground shifted under everyone's feet, including her own. I truly hope that wherever she is, she's found something better to build her life around than resentment. I mean that honestly. Bitterness is a heavy thing to carry, and I've never wished that weight on anyone, not even her. As for me, I didn't celebrate. There wasn't a party, no toast raised in victory. The day the results came through, I drove out to the old house instead, the one my parents left us, the one this entire ordeal had technically been about, though by the end, it had become about something so much larger than square footage and property lines. I walked through the rooms slowly, running my hand along the same banister I used to slide down as a kid. Standing for a long moment under the oak tree my father planted the year I was born, now tall enough to shade half the backyard. I took my Navy Cross out of the small wooden box where I usually kept it, tucked away from daily view. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I've never needed to see it every day to remember what it meant. I held it in my palm for a while, feeling the weight of it, thinking about the young woman I'd been on the day I earned it, and the older woman I'd become in the years since, and how strange it was that the same medal that once nearly cost me everything in a courtroom had ultimately been the thing that saved me. I don't need anyone else's permission to know what I did was real. I never did. Honor was never about being recognized. It's about not betraying it. Even in the moments when no one else is watching. Even when the person questioning you sits above you in a black robe and a gavel and thinks that gives them the final word. It doesn't. It never has. I stepped out onto the front porch that evening as the sun started to dip behind the trees. The American flag my father used to fly, still hanging from its post by the steps, moving gently in the breeze. And I thought about how some people believe power gives them the right to insult another person's dignity. But in a country built on the rule of law, power only survives when it walks hand in hand with responsibility. The day that judge ordered me to remove my Navy Cross, he thought he was putting me on trial. In the end, it was his own career standing before the bench. If this story resonated with you, even in a small way, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It truly means more than you'd think to hear from you. We have so many more stories like this one waiting to be shared, so if you don't want to miss the next one, please go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep this journey going.